Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you to the Barings UNC Charlotte Economic Forecast, presented for the first time ever as a virtual event. So I am Jennifer Troyer, Dean of the Belk College of Business at UNC Charlotte. First, I need to recognize Barings for their generous and continued support. So Barings has been a sponsor since 2010. Their support is really a stellar example of how Charlotte's business community helps us fulfill our mission to serve the community as North Carolina's urban research business school. For those of you who don't know, Barings is a global financial services firm with more than $227 billion in assets under management and over 2,000 associates. Their firm's global headquarters are in Uptown Charlotte, and they maintain a strong international presence with offices throughout Europe, North America, and Asia Pacific. Thank you, Barings, for your continued support. I would also like to welcome our alumni and supporters of the college. The Belk College offers 9 undergraduate programs and 8 graduate programs, plus executive education for continuing learning. Just for example, our MBA program is ranked #1 among part-time public MBA programs in North Carolina, according to U.S. News and World Report. You can learn more about all of our programs, our college, and our events at belkcollege.uncc.edu. So with this new format, the forecast will be a little different this afternoon. The forecast presentation will be followed by Q&A. If you have questions that pop up during the presentation, you can submit them at any time to the host through the chat feature. And I will get those and then ask John during the Q&A session your questions. For those of you on Twitter, you can join us today by using #NCForecast. So and now, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague and our speaker, Dr. John Connaughton. John is the Barings Professor of Financial Economics in the Belk College of Business. John has served as Director of the Economic Forecast since 1981, each quarter sharing where North Carolina's economy has been and where he thinks it's going next. So please join me in welcoming John Connaughton.
Thank you, Jennifer. And this is certainly a different experience with a virtual forecast. We've been doing this for many, many years. And over the years, we've always had a live quarterly outlook. But this year, due to the COVID-19, we are transitioning to a virtual forecast. So we'll see how it goes. Today, we are going to talk about a number of different things. First of all, we're going to review 2019. And we're going to look at that because we now have all the hard data for the North Carolina economy. And as a result, we can take a look and see exactly how 2019, how the state performed economically in terms of GDP and also in terms of jobs. Then we're going to take a quick look at the COVID-19 facts. That's pretty straightforward. And then we'll look at the economic measures and statistics. As it turns out, there are a number of things that are numbers that are going to come out in the next couple of months, some of which we need to understand how they were derived so we can interpret those. We're going to see some numbers that we've never seen before, and we need to understand what they mean. Then finally, we're going to take a look at the outlook for the state in 2020 and look at what the COVID-19 recovery might look like over the next couple of years. For those of you that have been attending the quarterly briefings, you know that this most recent expansion beginning in July of 2009 is the longest economic expansion on record. It's 128 months through February of 2020. The previous longest expansion was during the 1990s from March 91 to March 2001. By the way, the NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research, is the keeper of the business cycle data, and they have recorded 33 economic expansions since 1854. So we just went through the longest, and unfortunately, it was not done yet, but for the COVID-19 and the mandatory lockdown that we experienced beginning in March. Over this economic expansion, if we take a look at how the state has performed versus the U.S., we notice that there's a difference in the average GDP growth during that period of time. The U.S. has averaged 2.3% over that period. North Carolina has only averaged 1.8%. and this will have an impact on our recovery versus the U.S. recovery. We have talked in the past at the quarterly briefings about some of the reasons why we have lagged behind the U.S. over the past decade, primarily due to productivity changes in the state's economy since 2000. All right, so let's take a quick look back at 2019. On a quarterly basis, you can see that GDP started out fairly strong. We took a dip in the second quarter, but we finished up the year fairly strong at 3%. Overall, the GDP growth rate was 2.2%. And this year, 2019, that's pretty much in line, 0.1% lower than the US GDP growth rate. So that was a pretty good year for us, 2019. On a sector by sector basis, and for those of you that are joining us for the first time that haven't been to our quarterly live briefings, let me take a second here to explain how to interpret this chart. It really provides two pieces of information. On the horizontal axis, if you follow my cursor here, the horizontal length of this bar tells us how much that sector's GDP in real terms grew during 2019. So for example, if we look at business and professional services, we see that it grew by 7.5%. Retail trade grew by 5.8%. On the vertical axis, it's essentially a pie chart. These numbers will add up to 100%. And the vertical axis tells us what each sector's percent of total output accounts for. What that enables us to do is visually look at just the areas, the size of these boxes, the area of these boxes, and get an idea as to how important each sector was in its contribution to overall GDP. So growth for the year. So we can see that finance, insurance, and real estate, business and professional services, retail trade, and wholesale trade. These were the four sectors that basically drove the state's economy during 2019. On an employment basis, total employment grew by 1.7%. We added 77,300 net jobs from December of 2018 to December of 2019. And again, we can see those sectors that had the strongest employment growth: finance, insurance, and real estate, transportation, warehousing, and utilities, and hospitality and leisure services. Those were the sectors that provided the strongest employment growth during 2019. Okay. The coronavirus. Well, for those of you that were here last quarter in our Uptown campus, you remember we talked about coronavirus at that time. But what's interesting is that by the 11th of March, we had 1,205 total cases in the United States and 37 deaths. At the same time, North Carolina had 8 cases and no deaths as of the 11th of March. So the last time we met, we were just looking at I would say the very, very tip of the iceberg. And we really hadn't got a sense as to where this thing was going at that point in time. Coronavirus cases by state in March. North Carolina, as I said, had 7. Washington was the leader. New York is just starting to take off, but Washington, California, the West Coast was really the bulk of where the cases were at that point in time. It really hadn't started to hit the East Coast in big numbers yet. What we were talking about then were what we could expect over the next quarter before we met again, and take a look at these demand side impacts. How would this virus have an effect on consumer confidence? And how would mandatory quarantines affect overall growth and employment levels? Those were sort of some of the things that we're very uncertain about. We also were concerned about industries that might be at risk, certain industries that might be in trouble because of what we expected to see with some mandatory quarantines. On the supply side, we were going to start to see supply chain shortages, and there was nothing more clear than that than a week later when there was no toilet paper to be had, no paper towels, and no hand sanitizer. We had plants to shut down that were in the supply chain. Very, very serious issue. And we talked a little bit about the China experience as Foxconn had started to open back up again. And we were going to trace exactly what that might look like over the next 3 months. Today, as of May 27th, we have 1,686,000 cases, 93,000, almost 94,000 deaths. Now, I want to caution you, a lot of the news media this morning saying we reached 100,000. There are different ways in which this stuff is counted. What we're looking at here is confirmed, not suspected cases. So these are confirmed cases and confirmed deaths. Right now, we're adding plus or minus about 20,000 cases per day nationally, and we seem to be stabilizing somewhere in the plus or minus 800 range of new deaths per day. So that's where we are sitting right now. In North Carolina, we're up to 24,000 cases, 766 deaths. We're adding about 400 new cases a day, 400 plus cases a day, and we're now experiencing about 10 deaths per day. Now, to kind of put this in perspective, back on May 25th, we had a pretty good consistent look at the state-by-state cases compared to the U.S. cases. And as you can see here, New York led the way with 359, almost 360,000 cases. New Jersey, Illinois, Massachusetts. You can see that North Carolina was 21st on the list of 50 states plus the District of Columbia, and South Carolina 30th. What's interesting to note is the 5 asterisk states, which basically are the northern I-95 corridor from Boston down through New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania metro areas. They have accounted for 44% of the total U.S. cases. So that one area has really been the hotspot, if you will, of cases in this country. We look at this from per capita, but cases per 100,000. And so we adjust it for the size of the state. This chart basically tells us just the absolute number of cases per se. This is ranked based on cases per 100,000. New York was the hotspot with 1,850 cases per 100,000. You can see that South Carolina turned out to be, 37th in terms of rank, and North Carolina, which has basically a rate that's 1/10 the New York rate in terms of cases per 100,000. We turn out to be 42nd. So we're pretty low on a per capita basis in terms of cases out of the 50 states, and plus the District of Columbia. On a county by county basis within North Carolina, we got some strange situations. I would think, not being a virologist or an infectious disease specialist, that density of population, mass transportation, et cetera, would all be leading indicators as to where those cases would show up. But as you can see here, we have a lot of small counties in North Carolina that have quite a few cases per 100,000. Mecklenburg County turns out to be 26th of the 100 counties, and the state has 36 counties that are worse than the state, and another 64 counties that are not as bad as the state overall cases per 100,000. So this is just some statistics to give you a sense as to two things. One, where we stand as a state in terms of infections and deaths, but also what we see as incredible geographical differences in terms of how this virus has been impacted different communities. It's all over the place, and where you live really does matter in terms of how much risk you are at in terms of having problems with this disease. All right, for the U.S., we've all heard for the last 2 months, flattening of the curve. And one of the best ways to look at that is the percentage change in cases. What I've done looking at this is a moving average, because the states are erratic in reporting cases. And so a 2-day moving average is a little bit safer and smooths the curve a little bit. Right now, we're just over 1%. We've been at 1 to 1.5% now for the last 5 days in terms of percent new cases on the existing cases. And so that's getting pretty close to flat. As you run out over time, it's going to be very, very difficult to change this number very much in a downward direction. But what we want to do is to pay attention to this number, because this will be the number that will start to indicate spikes that might occur later in the summer. In terms of flattening the curve and new day cases, as you can see, new cases have been going down since early April. You can see a fairly steady trend here to where we're now down in the 20,000 cases per day area. All right, talked a little bit about economic measures and statistics, and we're going to have some numbers come out pretty soon that are going to be, I don't want to say troubling, but they're going to be a little shocking. I think the number one issue that's going to come out is when we provide second quarter GDP. Now, what I've done here is provide a chart that will help us understand how to interpret some numbers. US GDP, and I cursor here, just follow along. In the fourth quarter of 2019, real GDP reached $19,222 billion. So that's kind of the high watermark of GDP. And going forward, we want to look at that and see how long it takes us to get back to that number. Now, you'll see here that the annualized percent change in the fourth quarter was 2.1%. Okay. You have to be careful about that because under normal circumstances, we report quarterly GSP, this $19 trillion, at an annual rate. So real GDP wasn't $19 trillion in the fourth quarter. It was more like $4.8 trillion. And when we report the growth rate from the fourth quarter, from the third quarter to the fourth quarter, it didn't actually grow by 2.1%. It only grew by 5%. You can do the math on this. 19,222 divided by 19,121, that's 0.5%. Okay. But what we do is we raise that 0.5% to the fourth power to give us an annualized rate, because we are telling you that if the economy continues to grow for the next 3 quarters like it did this quarter, we will have achieved a 2.1% growth rate over that year. All right. Normally, this is not a problem. It allows us to compare quarterly growth rates to annual growth rates using the same yardstick. You'll see in the first quarter of 2020, we dropped by 4.8%. Number came out this morning with the second cut of that. It's actually down by 5%. Okay. On just a simply quarterly change basis, that was only a 1.2% drop. Now, here comes the really interesting thing. In the second quarter, I've seen estimates all the way to 40% decline in GDP in the second quarter. I've took an average of some of the better national forecasts, 35.7%. And I just want to make sure you understand that when that number comes out, somewhere between 35 and 40% in July of this year, telling us what this April, May, June quarter, what happened, and you see 35, 40% decline, you don't immediately say, oh my goodness, we lost almost half of our GDP. No, we haven't. That's really a 10% decline. It's really 10.5% decline during that quarter. And if it doesn't decline again, that's it. That's all you're going to get. In fact, what we know is that in the third quarter, we'll actually have some things pick up. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But I just wanted to bring to your attention to prepare you when those numbers start to come out at the end of July. All right, so what will the second quarter actually look like? What do we got? What's in store for us? All right, starting next week, we start to get some of the disturbing numbers. On June 5th, we're going to get the May unemployment rate and the number of jobs that were lost or gained during that period of time. On July 2nd, we'll get the June unemployment rate and jobs. On July 30th, we will get the second quarter GDP. You may want to hold this slide and keep it because it'll give you a sense as to when these numbers come out. You keep your ear to the barometer, if you will, of what's going on here. The North Carolina May unemployment rate will be out a few weeks later, June 19th. Then the U.S. rate, North Carolina June rate will be out July 17th. And every Thursday, we get the weekly initial unemployment claims like we got this morning. We'll talk about that in just a second. All right, so here we have the claims. Now, the claims that came out today were 1.9 million for the nation. And you can see it's been trending downward since the peak of almost 7 million in the week of March 28th. Now, let me help you understand how the unemployment numbers are generated nationally and how you can use these new claims to understand what's going to happen, how it can be a forecaster of what the unemployment rate will be. These are weekly claims and they're gross. So they're just the people that applied for unemployment insurance, not the number of people who got jobs during this period of time. So it's not a net number, it's a gross number. The monthly unemployment survey goes out the week of the month that includes the 12th day. So what I've done here is to take 4 weekly claims that crop up leading to the week that will have the 12th. So what we have here is on the 12th of April, that week, we did the survey for people that are unemployed. During the previous 3 weeks and that 4th week, we had 22 million people apply for unemployment insurance. All right. And that led to the unemployment rate that we had that was released just a couple of weeks ago. During this next period, beginning on the 18th of April, we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks to the 9th of May these and claims are going to be new folks that are going to pop up on the May unemployment list, and that's 14.5 million, right? When you add these 4 weekly claims together. These 2 claims won't show up until the June unemployment statistics. There's also one other thing we need to pay attention to. When the BLS releases these reports, it's about a 35-page release. Buried in it is a 1-page commissioner's statement. What I want to do is to read this highlighted, bold-typed sentence out of the commissioner's statement. It says, if the workers who were recorded as employed but absent from work due to other reasons over and above the number absent for work for other reasons in a typical April, if they had been classified as unemployed on temporary layoff, the overall unemployment rate would have been almost 5 percentage points higher than that which was reported. Just to put this in perspective, this is roughly 8 million people that we're talking about here, and they were the people that were on the payroll protection plan in April, okay? So they were not at work, but they were not laid off because they were still technically being paid. That gave us this 14.7% unemployment rate, okay? And basically, if you add that 5 percentage points to it, it would have been 19.7. Based on the 14.5 million additional people who filed for initial claims since the April unemployment rate came out, this 14.7% number will jump to 20%. So it's very likely that when we get the May unemployment rate next Friday, it's going to be 20%. And in reality, it's going to be closer to 25 because we'll still have people, those 8 million people that are still on the payroll protection plan. And if they had been included as unemployed, we would have seen the rate raise to 25%. All right. In North Carolina, we do the same thing. The numbers come out. Today, we had 43,000 people. Oh, by the way, I want to go back to something just real quickly. You can see these numbers here. Under normal circumstances, initial new claims, weekly claims, are somewhere in the 200 to 250,000 range. So you can see how dramatic these are. In North Carolina, they're usually about 3,000 to 3,500 new claims per week. Those are gross new claims. You can see here that in the April series, we had 543,000 total additional claims during that 4-week period. We're looking at about 348,000 in the 4 weeks in May. And then, as you can see, we're going to be dropping down here, probably less than 150,000 that'll be added in June. For North Carolina, we started with 4.4%. We rose to 12.2%. So our rate did not rise as high as the US rate did. We're going to add, or we've added 348,000 new folks to the list. That's going to generate about a 17% May unemployment rate when it comes out. And when we add in the payroll protection plan, folks, it's probably going to be closer to 22%. But as you can see, we're doing about 3% better than the US in terms of our unemployment rate. In terms of job loss per sector, where are we losing jobs? You can see that leisure and hospitality services is the #1 loser. Basically, about 40% of the 21,000 jobs came out of leisure and hospitality. Educational and health services are next, and retail trade is next. So you can see we've seen some serious job losses, if you will, particularly in leisure and hospitality services. For North Carolina, the same picture is true. Of the 616,000 jobs that we've lost so far between February and April, almost half of them came from leisure and hospitality services. Most of the other sectors are bumping along fairly well. Education and health services. This is primarily health services because so many doctors and dentists' offices closed during this period of time. It was only the hospitals, and they were only doing COVID cases during March and April. As strange as it seems, the unemployment rate disparity between states is absolutely phenomenal. Remember, the US had a 14.7%. We were 12.2. but you can see that Nevada had a 28.2% rate of unemployment, Hawaii 22.3%. What do they have in common? Obviously, hospitality and leisure services. But we also see Michigan, Rhode Island, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois. These are all heavy manufacturing states, and they all suffered from plant closures. All right. So that's really what we're dealing with here. On the other side of the coin, some states had very little impact. Connecticut, Minnesota, Nebraska, North Dakota, Wyoming. These are all small states, with the exception of, say, Missouri and Utah, but they did not have nearly as big an impact in terms of their unemployment rates in April as did the U.S. and a number of other states as well. All right, so recovery options. What's our recovery going to look like here? We got basically four options. We got the deep V that everybody was hoping for early, that we're going to shut things down for 4, 5, 6 weeks, and then boom, we're going to recover right back to where we were by the end of the year. Probably not going to happen. Now we're talking about the Nike swoosh. We have the decline. We've had that pretty much. And now we start the slow path back to recovery. And the question is, how long is the swoosh? We also have the dreaded W. Everybody's concerned about that. And that is the drop. We start picking back up, and then we have a rebound in cases. Whether that happens sometime this summer, whether it happens next fall or late fall or early winter, nobody knows what that answer is, and nobody is sure what it might look like and what the response might be in terms of, again, quarantining and shutdowns. And then finally, we've got the worst case scenario, and that's what I call the lazy hockey stick. We have the decline, and it just kind of bumps along for several years, and we really don't get our mojo back, if you will. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at what the Nike swoosh looks like and how long it's going to be before that point reaches that point. How many quarters is it? Okay, so let me give you a U.S. GDP example. This is not a forecast. This is just an example so you get a sense as to what's going on here. All right, excuse me. So we had this big quarterly drop in the second quarter, 35.7% that I showed you earlier, 10.5% on a quarterly basis. Then we start to see these big popbacks. So the third and fourth quarter, everything opens up again, and we get some pretty hefty pops. All right, but we're still down 5.9% or 6% for the year for 2020 when all said and done. Then we start to see these really strong growth. I mean, anytime you see 6.8% annualized growth rate in a quarter, that's a pretty hefty growth. But what I want you to do is I want you to look at, okay, in order for us to get back to $19.2 trillion, which is where we started, it's going to take almost a 7% growth rate for the entire 2021 year. So in other words, here we are in the middle of 2020. Best case scenario is with phenomenal growth and no rebound, we're looking at essentially 6 more quarters or a year and a half before we get back to where we were in December of 2019. Okay. What's fighting us? Well, in February, consumer confidence was 130.7. It's an index number. 90's kind of normal, but you can see we've had basically a 33%, 34% drop in consumer confidence in the past 2 months, down to 85.7. The really good news is that the May number basically was the same as the April number, and that suggests to me that people, they got hit, they were concerned, but with places starting to open up in May, they can start to see light at the end of the tunnel. It's very critical that consumer confidence does not drop anymore. To put it in perspective, at the bottom of the Great Recession, you can see consumer confidence was down here at 25%. So that's really what's going to drive this. We've seen a lot of argument and discussion take place over the past couple of months, particularly the last 2 weeks, between whether governors have the right to open up and how fast they should open up, and whether the president can play in that space or not. At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter what the governors do or what the president does. It's really how consumers respond. We have consumers that I can place into 3 groups: those that are ready to get on with their life and they're willing to take the risk of contracting Corona-19 and what it might mean to their health. We have a group that wants to begin to open up, but wants to be very, very cautious and is going to be very careful about how they participate in the economy going forward. And we have another group that's basically scared and is not going to participate in the opening and is going to continue on a pretty much a modified lockdown basis going forward until there's a vaccine. And we don't know how big each of those groups are, but at the end of the day, how many people wind up going back to a restaurant? how many people wind up going back to a theme park, how many people get on an airplane is going to be decided not by governors, not by the president, but by consumers and their willingness to participate in the economy going forward over the next year and a half or so. So quickly, North Carolina forecast for 2020, what it's going to look like. Well, I think we're going to have about a 30% decline in the second quarter. All right, that's about 8% on just a basis. We'll probably have some pretty hefty growth in the second, third, and fourth quarters. But overall, we're looking at a negative of 4.4% over the 2019 GDP level. Sector by sector, all but two sectors are going to have declines. Those that are going to decline the least are finance, insurance, and real estate, and government. And I want to make a point here. The fact that finance, insurance, and real estate is not in trouble is a good news for the ability of the economy to recover from this going forward. The fact that unlike the 2009, 10, 11, and 12 period, where banks were really zombie banks and not doing what banks do, banks are in the position at this point in time that they will probably be able to facilitate businesses reopening and borrowing money and moving forward. Okay. You can see obviously hospitality and leisure services, 34% drop. Other services, 13% drop. Those are the big ones. Wholesale and trade and retail trade are also down, as is our manufacturing industries. On a job basis, from December of 2019 to December of 2020, we're going to have 30,000 jobs lost in the state. Pretty sad number. Not as bad as the 600,000 we've lost so far. We'll add about half of those back by the end of the year. Again, the sectors with the biggest losses: hospitality and leisure services and other services as well. Our North Carolina rate, I believe, is going to peak at published rate in May of 2020 and start a pretty significant downturn during the summer as people whose jobs are still there return to work. We'll talk a little bit about whether those jobs are going to be there and how we can figure that out in just a second. But then it's going to start to taper off so that by the end of 2020, we're looking at just under a double-digit rate, 9.9% for North Carolina. What we can expect going forward. Consumer confidence is key. How consumers participate in this recovery is going to be instrumental on how long this recovery takes. We are very uncertain about COVID-19 spikes, whether it will happen in the summer, whether it will happen next fall, next winter. We do not know. We have no idea how that's going to play out. We also have on the demand side industries at risk long term because of consumers. Cruise industry, airline industry, a lot of even healthcare industry are at long-term risk because of concerns over COVID-19 until we get a vaccine. On the supply side, we're still going to have periodic supply chain shortages. We are most likely to have business failures that we don't know about yet. They're going to start to pop up in the next month once PPP goes away, and whether these firms, when they reopen up, are going to be able to, or even if they're going to be able to reopen up, is very unclear at this point in time. The other thing that's interesting is we're starting to see international industry bailouts. We've seen the French basically bail out their automobile industry. We've seen the Germans bail out Lufthansa. These are big bailouts. What are we going to do going forward? That's an interesting question. All right, 2021 outlook. By the end of 2021, the fourth quarter, we will probably be close to our GDP of fourth quarter of 2019 of $497 billion, but we'll be about 1.3% lower. Employment will be close to the employment by then, but about 78,000 jobs fewer. That's going to take almost a year at that point to get out of the pipeline. And the unemployment rate in December will be of 2021 will be 6.5%. It'll be 3 percentage points higher than it was in December of 2019. All right, can the Fed do something? Boy, golly, they sure have. The current effective federal funds rate is basically 0.05%. It never got that low during the Great Recession. It always hovered between about 0.15 and 0.25%. So we are seeing very, very low effective rate, which has obviously given rise to the concept that we may see actually negative rates in the next second half of this year. They've also passed, or they've instituted, 700 billion round of quantitative easing. If you look at all of these things, I don't have time to go through them, but they're all designed to make sure banks keep working. That's what they're done. They're not necessarily, there is a paycheck protection program, liquidity facility that's similar to the PPP, but it is to borrow money to do that. And but the bottom line here is it's basically to make sure the financial system in this country continues to operate through this downturn and during the recovery that will begin in the third quarter of the year. Should Congress do something? Real quick, they passed 4 bills, $8.3 million for the Preparedness and Response Appropriations Act early on. Bill number 2 was the Families First Act. That was $183 billion. The big one was $2 trillion. That's the CARES Act. That was the payroll protection plan, the recovery checks, additional money for the unemployment insurance funds, etc. And then the last piece was the supplemental payroll paycheck protection program, another $484 billion. So that was all total, just under $3 trillion. There's going to be another program going forward, but we really don't know what it's going to look like right now. Hopefully we will learn from some of the mistakes we made in the earlier programs and really make this a targeted program that will take effect in the third quarter to really stimulate economic demand, get those consumers out there buying things. One of the things that's been talked about, which would cost essentially $442 billion based on 2018 data, is a Social Security tax holiday that would allow basically individuals to increase their paycheck by 6.2% after taxes. So that's one of the things that has been talked about. We'll finish up things that we need to be paying attention to going forward. We've got interest rates. The Fed Open Market Committee meets on June 9th and 10th. We also, at the end of each month, we get the consumer confidence number. I don't really think the Fed's going to do much in terms of interest rates, but I think what they're going to do is probably announce some additional quantitative easing. We've got continuing and maybe even escalating trade war as a result of the COVID-19. We don't know what that's going to look like going forward. Finally, U.S. monthly job growth first Friday of every month, and the unemployment rate as well comes out. And the one that we really need to be paying attention to is second quarter GDP on July 30th. Bottom line here is this: we've taken the biggest hit that the economy has taken since the Great Depression of the 30s. We've not seen anything like it since then. This dwarfs the Great Recession of 2007, 8, and 9. And it's going to be really interesting to see what happens going forward. The interesting thing, 2 interesting keys in this. One, there was no particular sense that there was a recession coming in terms of instability in the economy in January and February. So this was a very unknown that came in and hit us. 2, unlike every other recession that we have ever seen, employment or unemployment is not a trailing indicator, but it is a leading indicator. It is essentially people being thrown out of jobs and spinning the economy into recession. Typically, you tell me what the GDP is this quarter, I can tell you what the unemployment rate is going to be in 6 months. It's usually a lagging indicator. This has been very unusual. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens during the next year and a half. Okay, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have, and I want to thank you all for attending. And again, I want to mention that we will be doing this again in September, and we'll see how that works out. We'll be taking feedback on this to see how we can improve this presentation. Thank you very much, and now I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
Thanks, John. So we have a lot of questions. I will tell you.
That doesn't surprise me.
So, great, really important insights so far. So let's just talk about Charlotte first. So how is Charlotte specifically positioned to handle and come out of this? What are the challenges and strengths relative to the more rural areas of our state?
Okay, so Charlotte is fortunate in a couple of respects and unfortunate in another. It's fortunate in that it is a banking center. And as we know, finance, insurance, and real estate was not hit all that hard in terms of job losses or in terms of GDP declines. So that being in place means that when our April unemployment number comes out, and it won't come out for another couple of weeks, when that number comes out, we probably did not have our unemployment rate rise as much as the states or the US's. So that's number one. So we probably didn't take as big a hit as the state did overall. However, as a tourist, and it's not tourism for tourism's sake, it's business activity in terms of conventions and meetings and stuff like that. Our hotel industry and our restaurant industry have taken a big hit. And those are going to be extremely slow in coming back. Just as an aside, as something I should have mentioned in the presentation, when the April numbers came out, one of the interesting things is the average average hourly wage jumped by almost $10. And that's unheard of. And what that basically indicates is that all of the jobs that were lost were lower paying jobs, and all of the jobs that were kept were higher paying jobs. So the burden of this is unlike a normal recession where it tends to hit across all occupations. This one was primarily primarily hit at health, hospitality, and leisure services. And to the extent that we have some of that, that is obviously going to impact us going forward. But I think Charlotte will probably, Charlotte, Wake, and to some extent Durham, Chapel Hill, those three metro areas will probably recover sooner, and probably we should be back to where we were by late 2021.
So, question for you. So how long can financial services and real estate remain strong with so much weakness everywhere else?
Again, back to the answer I gave just a second ago, the weakness has been isolated into certain industries. I'll give you an example. Hospitality and leisure services, before this recession began, accounted for about 12% of employment, but only 3% of GDP. Okay, so we took a big employment hit in hospitality, but it didn't take a big hit on GDP. If you look at, say, Charlotte's economy, again, not like the rest of the state, but Charlotte's economy, Wake's economy, Durham's economy, the job losses there are not going to be anywhere near as great, because people who work in these metro areas have jobs that are more adaptable to online operation and working from home than do the hospitality and leisure services, where you've got to be out there at the front, or hospital and educational services. Again, health and education services, where you have to be out there on the front.
So we've gotten several questions about the amount of debt that we're taking on. So, are you at all concerned about the amount of debt that we're taking on?
All right. So when this all began, we had about $22 trillion of national debt. We were probably going to add another trillion and change under normal circumstances this year. And should we be concerned about that? Yeah, it's a little more than we ought to be. $500 to $600 billion is probably something that we can handle on a regular basis in terms of additional debt. Start getting to $1 trillion, it becomes a little bit more cumbersome to handle long term. So far, we have added close to $3 trillion on top of the $1 trillion. And that's the number that everybody's worried about. I will simply, say this. We went into this at about 106% of GDP in terms of our debt. A number of countries are well over that. Japan is over 200% of their GDP in terms of their national debt. So there's nothing magical about adding $3 trillion. And the only thing that I would say, and again, from an economist's perspective, there were a lot of really good things in the $3 trillion that went out in the package, but there were some things that were not so good, and hopefully we won't repeat. But if you're ever going to spend money in terms of fiscal policy stimulus, this is probably the time to do that. And so while it concerns me, I understand completely. And honestly, but for probably $2 trillion of the $3 trillion, this thing would have been a heck of a lot worse than it turned out to be.
So next question. I know everyone's focused on the negative impact of the pandemic, but do you foresee any positive outcomes in the long term, such as better social safety nets, more investment in healthcare, new investment in infrastructure, et cetera?
I'm going to take two cracks at this, two different tacks on this. Number one, I think that this has, and this is something we need to pay attention to going forward, because we're going to see some different recovery models, I guess you could say, than what we would have normally expected. I think this has accelerated online economic activity. I think a lot of folks that were slow in ordering online with their Amazon or, Instacart or what have you, have now been forced into that model. And going forward, they're probably not going to leave that model. And so it's going to have a big impact on brick and mortar establishments. It's going to accelerate what had been a long-term decline in brick and mortar. I think it's going to accelerate because I don't think people are going back. My wife has already told me without question, she ain't going back to a supermarket. Okay, get used to Instacart. Okay, so that's number one. So that's one thing that I think is changing. The second thing I think that's going to change is that we are going to spend a little bit more time, and I'm paraphrasing Donald Rumsfeld here, thinking about unknown unknowns and those kinds of things that you don't foresee, the black swan events, if you will. Clearly, we were not ready for this, and who knows what the next unknown will be, and you cannot prepare for all of the unknown unknowns because you don't know what they are. But I think that from a health perspective, we're going to be in a better position. We're going to spend money over the next couple of years preparing ourselves for something that comes up again like this. Third thing that's going to change. I think we've seen for the short term, even maybe even the intermediate term. I think we've seen a shift, if you will, in the globalization of the economy. The economy has been globalizing for the past 3 decades at a rapid pace since the early 1990s, when China was granted most favorable nation status for trade purposes. That's going to end. Not the most favorable nation status, but this ongoing march towards globalization. Not just in the United States, but I think a lot of countries are going to look at their supply chains and how they're affected by this, both from a security standpoint, but also just from a regular business standpoint. So I think we're going to see some changes going forward in that.
So, another series of questions is really on how soon will we have, how does this change if we get a vaccine sooner or later? That's really the kind of the
vaccine is critical. I mean, there's nothing. The Nike swoosh is based on a vaccine coming in the fourth quarter of 2020 or the first quarter of 2021. I've seen some strange responses. I saw a survey yesterday that said a third of the people aren't going to take the vaccine. Oh, that's their problem. I will take it as soon as it's offered. But I think that the vaccine is absolutely critical. We may wind up with some kind of therapeutic at some point in time, but that doesn't look as promising as a vaccine. The good news is that early on, the infectious disease people were telling us that, vaccines are 1.5 years, 2 years away. What we've seen is the length of time is that long because of risk involved with investing and gearing up for it. We've taken a lot of those legs out of the system, with the government essentially picking winners. I don't like that, but they picked a number of winners, and they're going to bear the risk of gearing up for production for the best looking virus vaccines prior to their being proven effective. And that will shorten that process. So it is possible we'll see something by the end of the year.
So where do you see interest rates going for the remainder of 2020 and into 2021?
Well, I have a 403B, which is essentially what most people have as a 401k. I have some money in that in a money market account. And I got a notice from the administrator of that, sir, you did too, Jennifer, suggesting that if rates are as low as they are at the end of this year, beginning in 2021, they will start charging us for our money market. I think that for the next 1.5 years, the prospect of negative interest rates is basically in the forecast. I don't see how, I cannot see, no matter how much fiscal policy Congress pushes out, no matter how much monetary and quantitative easing the Fed pushes out, I cannot see anything higher than essentially 0% federal funds rate for the next 18 months. And that, of course, will carry with it historically low mortgage rates. Hey, everybody, buy a car, because you're never going to get 7 years free financing again, and just about everybody's doing that now. Not to mention, there are all kinds of plans to reduce the price of the car as well. So, yeah, financing at this point in time, what do they say? Free money?
Yeah. Right. There's no such thing as free money. We know this, John.
Well, we'll see.
We'll see. Okay, one more question about the PPP. Right. So, what will the impact of the PPP be in, first and second quarter 2021 if companies aren't able to have their loans forgiven? And, do you expect?
I'm pretty sure, look, if the money was used in compliance with the program, which is basically 75% of the loan is given out in form of payroll protection, I believe that those loans will be, I think those loans will be forgiven. I don't think there was ever any, the hook was out there as a stick, if you will, I should say. The stick was out there to ensure that this money was not used for something else. Now, these companies are going to have to prove that. The books are going to have to be there, and it's going to have to, show that, yes, 75% of the loan went to my employees, okay? But if that happens, I don't think there's any question those loans will be forgiven. It would be a big mistake if they did that not to, because they're not going to be in a position to pay those things back for several years. So, yeah.
Got it. Well, thank you, John. So I will say that we are already planning for the next economic forecast.
Yes, we are.
September 23rd. So we will keep everybody posted on the format. This is one of our first virtual events, so we're really eager to receive your feedback. As you exit the event, you'll get a link to a short survey. So please tell us what you thought of the format. So this concludes our program today. Thank you, John Connaughton, and thanks for all of you for joining us for the UNC Charlotte Barings Economic Forecast today.
Thank you.